I'm coming to this topic with a higher education hat on, but also as a researcher and indeed a trustee of the Chartered Institution of Highways and Transportation, with a particular interest in future uncertainty. Uncertainty about the future shape of society, of our transport system, and of course, therefore, the types of skills we need and the forms of provision we might need to offer to fulfill those skills needs. I'm struck listening through the course of today, first of all, that when we're talking about the sector, we're actually, of course, in a very wide and diverse sector, particularly if one says highways and transportation. And the edges to that sector are becoming increasingly blurred. A colleague of mine who's a senior modeler was talking earlier this week about the fact that young people now apparently want to be data scientists rather than transport modelers. And so, of course, the mobility within the market is ever increasing. One has that feeling anyway. As a provider of degree apprenticeships, at an early part, I would say, in the learning curve, it's very interesting to listen to Charlotte and Keith, because I think my own institution is very practice-oriented. We're very keen to continue to develop our relationship with employers and provide employable graduates. And of course, we're now faced with a rather different teaching and learning model with degree apprenticeships, something that we're engaging with, I think, it's fair to say enthusiastically, but we are also conscious of being on that learning curve, trying to understand both what employers are really motivated by here. Is it just using up the levy contribution they've been asked to make, or would they be enthusiastic regardless of that levy, and how will that continue into the future? Does it make financial sense for us as a university? It's worth reminding ourselves that universities get very little funding directly from government these days. We're in a market like everyone else. We don't quite feel like private sector yet, but it's gone that way. So we have to understand the financial foundations, as well as moving on to how this fits within our broader strategic goals as an institution, as a knowledge institution. Given the uncertainty that we're facing in the future, something I'm very pleased, again, that my own institution, like other HEIs, is now looking at, is the importance of what we call the enterprise attribute in our graduates. In other words, of course, we provide students with technical skills through the course of their studies, but increasingly we recognize that those skills alone are not going to equip them for being resilient and effective in both their lives in general and their working lives and careers in particular. So one tries to simultaneously ensure we're delivering technical skills, but also transferable skills, creative problem solving, calculated risk-taking, effective communication, and so on, which, regardless of where they are in this spectrum of skills and in this diverse sector that we're talking about, they will be able to act in an effective way and provide value to their employers. Lifelong learning, just to touch upon briefly, I'm sure like many of you, I started out as a civil engineering graduate. Most recently, I've been referred to as a transport sociologist. And I don't think I'd have got to where I am without that lifelong learning element. And I'm struck every day in coming to this exciting event, just how much knowledge there is that we need to keep engaging with and absorbing if we're to keep pace with the changes around us. And just a brief word, I've heard 2 or 3 mentions earlier today about the aging workforce, as if that's something to be concerned about, and I suppose in some dimensions it is. But having been recently to a later living conference, I was reminded that not only are we living longer, we're living healthier for longer, and indeed to have a long and healthy life can be synergistic with having a longer working life. And indeed, the future workforce is less composed of millennials than of those of us who will be living our later lives. So I think there's a demographic spectrum we shouldn't lose sight of. And as was mentioned earlier, apprenticeships are not just for those very early career starters. The skills spectrum, I think, from my own perspective, is very important. And we're moving not just from engineering, but from engineering right across to social science. I've seen the transport sector in my own sense as evolving through 3 eras. So first of all, we created the asset and the vehicles to use it. Then we moved into an era of managing the asset where we needed to understand human beings a bit more. And now we've moved into an era of managing the demand for the asset, which moves even further into the need to understand human beings, not just within our professions, but of course the end users as well. So not losing sight of that skill spectrum is important. STEM, we hear a lot about STEM, and very important, of course, and excellent news indeed that we now have the Year of Engineering coming up next year. But if I can have a quick play on the acronym STEM, of course it's science, technology, engineering and maths, but I'd also like to suggest it should be shorthand for socio-technical effectiveness matters. And by that I mean that the transport system isn't just a technical system, and neither is it just a social system that provides the connectivity that underpins economic wealth and social well-being. It's a socio-technical system. And we really need to make sure the skills mix is appropriately crafted and not just focus on the skills quantum. We've talked today about attracting talent and retaining talent, but I think we shouldn't lose sight as well of how we apply that talent to best effect. Very pleased to hear a lot of emphasis on diversity and inclusion, and also the ever-present risk of unconscious bias. And I do think there's a concern I have around inertia in perhaps not just our profession, but any profession. There are a lot of people out there who have hammers, and if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, of course. And what we need to be encouraging or creating an environment for is for those earlier career professionals to feel a sense of empowerment and agency, to be able to constructively challenge the orthodox approaches within our profession and offer up new ways of thinking and, of course, bring innovation to the table. A very simple example of that within the transport planning professional, something I'm looking at with CIHT at the moment, is that the skills requirements at the moment focus on modelling and forecasting, looking at this uncertain future. And we're now asking probing questions about whether that's far too narrow a traditional definition, and in fact it should be much wider, looking at techniques for examining changing future supply and demand. And lastly, in part coming back to perhaps the demographic perspective, but I think a remark that was made during some work we did as CIHT looking to that future uncertainty was that there's a great deal of emphasis on developing skills through and up to the point of becoming a chartered professional. But we rather then fade away in terms of supporting people beyond that in their careers, and of course to ensure that we're developing leadership and leadership potential in those who are perhaps mid-career and going on from that. And if we don't have that leadership capability right, then we don't have the people to create the right environment for those earlier career professionals to be able to exercise those enterprising behaviours that I mentioned earlier. Thank you.